Captain Eva Rostova had seen the logs from the last mission into the chaotic Expanse. She'd watched the recordings until the raw data burned itself onto the inside of her eyelids. The first vessel, the UNS Principia, a ship staffed with the finest physicists and mathematicians in the Sol Federation, had lasted 17 hours. Its final transmission was a single repeating data packet that translated to the equation 1O. The ship was never seen again. The second, the UNS Logic, a vessel entirely controlled by the most advanced analytical AI ever created, lasted for 6 hours. Its final act was to methodically disassemble itself atom by atom, a process the AI's final report logged as the only rational solution to a paradoxical environment. Now, it was her turn. Her ship, the UNS Stargazer, was a vessel of the same class, but its mission profile and its crew were an act of profound institutional desperation. Rostova stood on the bridge, a space that felt less like a command center and more like a minimalist art gallery. The traditional science stations and tactical displays had been ripped out. In their place stood strange, elegant consoles that hummed with an unfamiliar energy. There was a holographic easel that shimmered in the dim light, a multi-tiered stand that held what looked like a fusion of a grand piano and a communications array, and a central, throne-like chair surrounded by floating script tablets. Her new crew was just as alien. The Federation, in its infinite and now clearly terrified wisdom, had concluded that if logic failed, they would try its antithesis. The greatest scientific minds had been broken by the Expanse, so the Stargazer was crewed with minds that operated on a different axis altogether. Rostova, a decorated explorer with a mind as sharp and straight as a laser, was to be their shepherd. Her job was not to command in the traditional sense, but to keep them alive, to point their strange talents in the right direction, and if the official mission brief was to be believed, to watch them chart the unchartable. "We are 5 minutes from the demarcation line, Captain," her first officer, a reassuringly conventional man named Gian, reported. His voice was a small island of normalcy in the sea of strangeness. The demarcation line was the point where the stable, predictable laws of physics began to fray. Beyond it lay the Expanse, a region of spacetime so volatile it wasn't just unexplored. It was considered by many to be non-existent, a wound in the fabric of the universe that defied reality itself. Rostova looked at her new department heads, assembled on the bridge. Her lead navigator was not a pilot but a poet. Her chief engineer was not a mechanic but a musician. Her director of astrometrics was not a scientist but a painter. They were humanity's last, most ridiculous hope. Rostova gripped the cool metal railing in front of the main view screen. She didn't know if this was the boldest experiment in human history or its most expensive, elaborate suicide note. The artists were an ecosystem unto themselves. They did not operate with the clean, hierarchical precision of a military crew. They drifted, they observed, they debated concepts Rostova couldn't begin to parse. Elias Vance, the lead narrator, was a man whose placid exterior concealed a mind of furious, ordered creativity. His graying hair was perpetually unkempt, and he wore a soft, worn tweed jacket over his Federation uniform, a personal affectation that command had, after much debate, allowed. He now sat in the central narrator's throne, his long fingers hovering over the floating script tablets. He believed the universe was a story, and that the Expanse was simply a chapter written in a language no one had yet learned to read. His job was to write their continuation. "A ship's log is not a record of the journey, Captain," he had explained to her during a briefing. "It is the journey's incantation. We have simply forgotten how to sing it properly." At the station that had once been engineering sat Serafina Lee, the principal composer. She was surrounded by the gracefully curved chassis of her instrument, the resonator. It was a masterpiece of sonic engineering, capable of producing frequencies that ranged from the subsonic vibrations that could turn lead to dust, to ethereal notes that seemed to hang in the air like spun glass. Serafina believed that physics was just a form of harmony. "The universe is a song," she told Rostova, her eyes distant. "The Expanse is what happens when the orchestra plays out a tune. My job is to find the key, to resolve the dissonance." And then there was Kalen Iris, a young, preternaturally quiet man who went by Kale. He stood before the holographic easel, a device that projected a three-dimensional cube of raw light. He was the abstract matter visualist. Where others saw empty space, Cale saw potential, an unprimed canvas. He rarely spoke, communicating instead in gestures and the subtle shifts of color he coaxed from his easel. His philosophy, as far as Rostova had been able to gather, was that matter was a form of persistent color, and reality was a matter of composition. The expanse to him was not a void, but a canvas that had been violently scrubbed clean, waiting for a new image. Rostova watched them take their stations. They were calm, focused, and utterly out of place. Her instincts, honed over 2 decades of navigating asteroid fields and stellar nurseries, screamed that this was wrong. These people shouldn't be here. They should have graviton specialists and quantum physicists. But the specialists and the physicists were gone, lost to the paradox. These strange creative souls were all she had left. "We are crossing the line," Gian announced, his voice tight. The view screen, which had shown the familiar, star-dusted black of space, flickered. The stars did not vanish. They began to drift, to swim like bioluminescent fish in an oil-slick sea. The ship groaned, a deep metallic sound of protest as the fundamental constants that held it together began to lose their meaning. This was it. The performance was about to begin. The transition was not a moment, but a process, like dipping a paintbrush into water and watching the color bleed into the clear liquid. The crisp lines of the bridge began to soften at the edges. A standard-issue coffee bulb on Gian's console briefly elongated into a shimmering thread of silver, before snapping back into shape. The ship's internal clock began to flicker between 1,000 different, simultaneous timestamps. This was the reality shear, the zone where the objective universe gave way to the subjective. Structural integrity is fluctuating, Gian reported, his knuckles white where he gripped his console. Gravitational plating is oscillating between 1.0 and 1.7 Gs. All scientific sensors are offline. They're reading everything and nothing. The ship shuddered violently and the lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. Rostova's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the point where the Principia had lost its way, where its crew had started screaming about the geometry being wrong. "Serafina," Rostova said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Give me a baseline." Serafina Lee closed her eyes, her hands gliding across the interface of the resonator. She was not reading data. She was listening. A low, resonant hum filled the bridge, a single perfect note that seemed to push back against the growing chaos. It was a sound so pure and stable that it felt like an anchor in a raging storm. The violent shuddering of the ship subsided into a steady, rhythmic vibration. The light stabilized. The coffee bulb remained a coffee bulb. "I have a root frequency," Serafina whispered, her eyes still closed. "It's fragile, but it's there. The expanse. It isn't noise. It's a million different songs playing at once. I found a chord that belongs in most of them." While Serafina held her note, Cale turned to his easel. The view screen was a mess of swirling, impossible colors and shapes that bent in on themselves. It was a direct feed of the chaos outside, a sight known to drive unprotected minds into catatonia. Cale looked at it with the calm, appraising gaze of an artist studying a landscape. "The light is undecided," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. His hands moved, and a soft, steady cerulean blue began to bleed from the holographic emitter at the center of his easel. He wasn't blocking the view from outside. He was giving it a suggestion. He was offering it a primary color to anchor itself to. Outside the ship, in the swirling madness, a patch of the chaos coalesced. The impossible colors swirled around a new focal point, a soft, unwavering blue that mirrored the light on Kyle's canvas. It was a landmark, a single point of reference where none should exist. They had done it. They had imposed 2 of the most basic elements of art, a single musical note and a primary color, onto a patch of space where the laws of physics had ceased to exist. They had not fought the chaos. They had harmonized with it. The ship was stable for now, floating in a tiny bubble of their own making. Their initial success was a fragile thing, a soap bubble in a hurricane. The moment Serafina's concentration wavered, the ship would shudder. If Cale looked away from his canvas, the blue landmark outside would begin to fray at the edges. They had a foothold, but they did not have a safe harbor. "We can't maintain this forever," Rostova stated, her mind racing. She was beginning to see the shape of this new, insane form of navigation. It wasn't about plotting a course. It was about building the road as you traveled. We need a narrative, something to bind these elements together. Elias. Elias Vance nodded, his eyes gleaming. He had been waiting, observing, finding the thread of the story. His fingers finally moved, dancing across the script tablets that surrounded his throne. Words began to flow not onto a screen, but into the ship's core systems, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the Stargazer's operational matrix. His voice, calm and measured, was broadcast softly across the bridge's comms, less like a captain's log and more like the opening of a classic novel. Log entry, Cycle 1, Day 1, Elias began. The UNS Stargazer has successfully entered the Expanse, finding refuge in a pocket of serene space. The vessel rests easy, held in the gentle embrace of a constant cerulean star. Its light, a beacon of tranquility, provides a steady anchor in the vast silent sea. The ship's systems are stable, its crew is calm, and the passage is smooth. He wasn't describing their situation. He was defining it. As he spoke, Kyle worked furiously at his easel, taking Elias's words as direction. His single blue landmark began to expand, to coalesce. He gave it a corona, lent it the soft, steady flicker of a distant sun. He painted the star that Elias was describing into being. Simultaneously, Serafina shifted her composition. Her single anchoring note blossomed into a complex, layered harmony. It was a gentle, sweeping melody that evoked a sense of peace and stability. The background music for the scene Elias was setting. It was a symphony of creation. The narrator provided the plot, the visualist painted the set, and the composer wrote the score. On the view screen, a miracle took shape. Outside the ship, a small, self-sustaining pocket of stable reality was forming. The chaotic swirls of the Expanse were pushed back, held at bay by the internally consistent, artistically coherent reality they were projecting. They had a stable star, a patch of calm space, and a ship that now believed on a fundamental level that it was safe. Rostova watched, her breath caught in her throat. The ship floated in a perfect sphere of calm, a few kilometers in diameter. Inside was order, peace, and the light of their newborn star. Outside was the screaming, formless madness of the Expanse. She looked at her crew of artists, their faces bathed in the blue light of the star they had just imagined into existence. The physicists had brought equations. The AI had brought logic. They had failed. These strange, wonderful people had brought a story, a song, and a painting. For the first time, Eva Rostova felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead. It wasn't certainty, and it wasn't confidence. It was wonder. The Cartographers of Sol had made their first mark on an impossible map. The serene blue star they had created was a masterpiece, a testament to their impossible new science. But it was a static creation, a single, perfect photograph in a universe that demanded motion. Their mission was not to build a haven. It was to chart a map. For 3 days they existed within their bubble of stability, running diagnostics, refining their techniques, and allowing Captain Rostova's mind to fully accept the reality of what her crew of artists could do. On the 4th day, she gave the order to move. It was an order that had no corresponding command in the ship's directory. There was no button for engage narrative drive. Rostova stood on the bridge, a director watching her cast as the performance began anew. "Elias," she said, her voice crisp. "Take us forward." Slow and steady. Elias Vance closed his eyes for a moment, then his fingers began their silent dance across the script tablets. His voice, once again patched into the ship's core, took on a rhythmic, forward-moving cadence. The UNS Stargazer, its brief respite concluded, continues its journey into the unknown. It moves with grace and purpose, a silver needle stitching a new line of order into the chaotic tapestry of the Expanse. The cerulean star, now a faithful companion, travels with them, casting its steady light on the path ahead. As he spoke, Serafina's composition shifted. The calm, ambient harmony evolved, picking up a gentle, driving rhythm. It was a traveling theme, a piece of music that spoke of exploration and steady progress. Kale, in turn, began to paint the path forward. He didn't render a starfield. That would have been a lie. Instead, he painted a channel of calm, cerulean light extending from the bow of the ship, a visual representation of the safe passage Elias was narrating. The ship began to move. There was no sensation of acceleration, no engine noise. The Stargazer simply began to exist further along the path they were actively creating. It was the smoothest, most silent form of travel Rostova had ever experienced. But the Expanse was not a passive canvas. As they moved deeper, they encountered a current of raw, aggressive chaos, a place where the universe's million out-of-tune songs clashed in a violent crescendo. Serafina cried out, her hands flying across the resonator's interface as a jarring, dissonant chord ripped through the bridge. The ship screamed, its hull plates groaning as their stable reality warped. On the view screen, Kale's calm blue channel was being eaten away by a furious, clashing violet. "The narrative is fraying," Elias shouted, his own voice strained. "The story has a conflict." Rostova's command instincts took over. "Don't fight it! Incorporate it," she ordered, the words coming from a place of pure intuition she didn't know she possessed. A story needs conflict. A song needs a crescendo. Her words broke through their panic. Serafina, instead of fighting the dissonant chord, began to weave it into her music. Her gentle traveling theme became a dramatic, powerful overture, the jarring notes of the Expanse becoming the tension that demanded resolution. Kyle stopped trying to paint over the violent violet and instead began to frame it, to give its chaos a beautiful, terrible shape, like a contained storm in a glass orb. Elias's narration took on a darker, more urgent tone. The Stargazer faces its first trial, a storm of raw creation that tests its resolve. But the ship is strong, its crew is brave, and it navigates the turbulent cosmic sea not with fear, but with wonder. They passed through the current. The ship shuddered. The lights flickered, but their bubble of reality held. On the other side, the violent music resolved back into the main theme, stronger and richer than before. The storm was now a part of their story, a memory that gave their journey depth and meaning. They had learned a critical lesson. They could not erase the chaos, but they could give it form, purpose, and in doing so, master it. It was during a period of relative calm, as the crew refined their traveling composition, that Serafina heard it. She held a hand up for silence, her head cocked, listening to something beyond the range of any sensor. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. No one else did, not at first, but she isolated the frequency on the resonator, amplifying a thin, ghostly thread of sound from the cacophony of the Expanse. It was a melody. It was impossibly sad, a simple, repeating four-note phrase that spoke of loss and loneliness. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was music. Rostova ordered Jian to analyze it. "There's nothing there, Captain," he reported, his face a mask of confusion. "No energy signature, no radio waves. According to our instruments, that sound does not exist." "Your instruments are irrelevant here," Elias murmured, his eyes fixed on the void. "This is a signal for us." As they focused on the sound, Kale saw a corresponding visual echo. Faintly, almost subliminally, a shape would flicker in the chaos ahead. A perfect crystalline octahedron that would appear for a fraction of a second before dissolving. At the same time, Elias felt a whisper at the edge of his thoughts, a single repeating line of text that wasn't quite words. It was the idea of a phrase. Where logic breaks, Rostova felt a cold knot form in her stomach. A repeating melody, a geometric shape, a fragment of text. It was a piece of art, broken and scattered but undeniably intelligent. And there was only one other mission that had come this far. "It's the Principia," Rostova said, the words tasting like rust. "It has to be. We cannot be certain," Jian cautioned. "It could be a native phenomenon." "A trap." "It is a lament," Serafina insisted, her fingers gently tracing the mournful notes on her interface. "It is a piece of music filled with grief." "It is not a trap." A debate ensued. Rostova's training screamed at her to be cautious, to analyze from a distance. A signal from a lost ship in a reality-destroying anomaly was the definition of a warning beacon. But her new role, the director of this strange orchestra, called for a different perspective. She looked at her crew. They were not seeing a threat. They saw a fellow artist lost in the dark, and they heard a call for help. "Set a course to follow that signal," Rostova ordered, her voice firm. "Elias, write us a search and rescue mission." Serafina harmonized with that melody. "Kale, focus on that shape. Let's go find out who's singing." The crew turned to their instruments with a renewed sense of purpose. The mission was no longer just about cartography. It was about to become a rescue. The journey toward the signal was a descent into a specific, structured kind of madness. The random chaos of the Expanse began to give way to an unsettling pattern. They were entering what Serafina called an echo chamber. a vast region where a powerful, failed composition had collapsed and was now repeating itself ad infinitum. Ghostly images of the UNS Principia began to flicker in and out of existence around them. One moment it was there, pristine and whole. The next it was a mangled wreck, its hull twisted into an impossible shape. These were not solid objects, but after-images of possibility, moments of the ship's past and potential futures all trapped in a loop. The sound was even more disturbing. Elias's tablets began to pick up fragments of the Principia's final log. They weren't audio recordings, but raw conceptual data, which Serafina's resonator translated into agonizing sounds. The calm scientific voice of the Principia's captain became a screech of feedback. Complex equations were rendered as grinding, dissonant chords. It was the sound of a logical mind being torn apart by an illogical universe. Finally, they reached the epicenter of the repeating phrase that Elias had sensed. Where logic breaks. It was a line from the final desperate poem of the Principia's chief scientist, a man named Dr. Eris Thorne. They found his last official log entry, the one that had baffled the Federation for years. The final data packet was simple, 100. It's not an equation, Elias breathed, his face pale with understanding. It's a poem. The shortest, most destructive poem ever written. He brought the text up on the main screen. 1 becomes 0. Where logic breaks. He was trying to do what we do, Kale murmured, watching the octahedron shape flicker and shatter nearby. He was trying to impose a simple, absolute order on the chaos. But his story was a negation, a paradox, Rostova finally understood. You could not command the Expanse to make sense. A rule like 1 was an act of violence against the nature of reality. Thorne, in a moment of desperate, logical genius, had tried to write a universal law to cancel out the chaos. Instead, the paradox he created had become a self-sustaining black hole of meaning, shattering this pocket of reality and trapping the consciousness of its creator within the echo of his failure. The scientists of the Principia had realized too late that they needed to be artists. But the only art they knew was the art of the absolute, and in a place of infinite possibility, the absolute was poison. At the heart of the echo chamber, suspended in a storm of repeating paradoxes, was the source. It was not a body. It was not a machine. It was a point of pure disembodied consciousness, flickering in time with the sad melody and the shattering octahedron. It was the ghost of Dr. Eris Thorne, a being of pure thought trapped within his own broken art. He could not be hailed or rescued by any conventional means. He was a part of the fabric of this wounded space. We can't pull him out, Serafina said, her expression one of profound sympathy. We have to give him a place to rest. We have to finish his composition. It was the most complex and delicate work they had ever attempted. This was not about creating a reality for themselves, but for someone else. A mind fractured by grief and paradox. They had to heal a story. Serafina began first. She did not try to overpower Thorne's mournful four-note melody. She harmonized with it, weaving a rich, complex counter-melody around it. She took his statement of grief and turned it into a conversation, a musical dialogue that acknowledged his pain but offered a glimmer of resolution. The agonizing dissonance in the echo chamber began to soften. Then Kale addressed the endlessly shattering octahedron. He did not try to force it to be stable. With his holographic easel, he began to paint around it, creating a beautiful, intricate crystalline lattice. He took the image of a breaking prison and transformed it into the image of a blossoming jewel. The shape still fractured, but now, each fragment became a new perfect facet in a larger, more beautiful structure. Finally, it was Elias's turn. He looked at the destructive poem on his tablet. He could not erase it, but he could add to it. He took Thorne's fragment and began to write, his narrative flowing into the very heart of the chamber. His voice was soft, but it resonated with the power of creation. 1 becomes 0 where logic breaks, he recited. Then he added his own lines. But in the breaking new worlds we make, a story ends, a new one starts. A universe of mended hearts. Rest now, thinker. Your work is done. A song of silence has been won. The effect was instantaneous. The story was complete. The paradox was resolved. The echoes of the Principia faded. The agonizing sound ceased. The mournful melody found its final peaceful chord. In the center of the space, Thorne's consciousness coalesced one last time. The flickering light stabilized, forming a single, perfect, gently pulsing crystal, the octahedron from his thoughts now whole and permanent. It was a sculpture of space-time, a memorial and a sanctuary. A final message, clear and lucid, touched all of their minds. It was not words, but a feeling of immense gratitude, of peace, of release. Then it was silent. Rostova looked at the beautiful, silent crystal floating in the now calm space. They had charted a new region, yes, but they had done more. They had rescued a soul from a hell of his own making. She looked at her crew, not as artists or scientists, but as cartographers of a different sort entirely. They were not just mapping the stars. They were mapping the soul of the universe itself. The rescue of Eris Thorn changed the nature of their mission. They had begun as cartographers, tasked with mapping a hostile territory. They had become healers mending a wound in the fabric of space. Now, with a new and profound understanding of their abilities, they were ready to become true explorers. Captain Rostova, now a full convert to the strange science of her crew, gave the order to push deeper, beyond the region scarred by humanity's previous failures and into the true, primordial heart of the Expanse. The transition was palpable. The echoes of paradox and pain faded, replaced by a profound and overwhelming silence. This was a different kind of chaos. Not the violent clashing of broken laws, but the utter absence of them. Serafina described the feeling as a perfect, resonant quiet, the silence of a concert hall before the first note is played. Cale stood before his easel, his eyes wide, seeing not a void but a canvas scrubbed clean, shimmering with the potential of every color at once. It's an unwritten page, Elias Vance whispered from his narrator's throne, his voice filled with a reverence Rostova had never heard before. Everything up to this point has been a story written over, corrected, and torn. This is the beginning. Chapter 1. Here their creations were purer, stronger. When Cale painted a nebula into existence, its colors were more vibrant, its form more perfect than any he could have rendered in stable space. When Serafina composed a melody, it didn't just stabilize reality. It imbued it with a tangible emotional quality, a sense of peace or joy or melancholy. They were no longer just imposing order. They were breathing life into the void. Rostova watched them work, no longer a skeptical commander but a proud director. Her crew was not navigating the universe. They were writing it. Their ship, the UNS Stargazer, had become a pen, a brush, a musical instrument in the hands of masters. They began their true work, not just creating a path to travel through, but leaving behind small permanent motes of creation. They composed a solar system with a hauntingly beautiful song at its core. They painted a comet whose tail was a flowing, ever-changing abstract masterpiece. They narrated the life cycle of a crystalline asteroid belt, giving it a history, a purpose. They were not just mapping the Expanse. They were giving it landmarks. They were giving it a soul. It was Cale who saw it first. While painting a constellation into a patch of particularly deep black, he noticed a flaw in his canvas. It was a pattern, something that was not his own creation, nor was it the random noise of the Expanse. It was a form of art, but one with an aesthetic completely alien to human consciousness. He projected it onto the main view screen for the others to see. It was a mesmerizing, intricate dance of pure mathematical logic. It was a fractal pattern that evolved with the elegant precision of a perfect equation. A shape that was both infinitely complex and utterly simple. There was no color, only the brilliant white of pure concept against the black. There was no sound Serafina could detect, yet the pattern had a clear, undeniable rhythm. There was no narrative Elias could read, but it conveyed a story of profound, dispassionate intelligence. "What is it?" Rostova asked, her voice hushed. "It's a proof," Elias murmured, his eyes wide. "A mathematical proof presented as art. It's beautiful. And it's not ours." They had found the first definitive sign of intelligent, non-human life in the Expanse, but it was not a species of explorers or warriors. It was a species of mathematicians, of architects, of artists whose medium was pure logic. While humanity had approached the chaos with the messy, emotional, collaborative tools of story and song, this other intelligence had approached it with the cold, perfect elegance of numbers. And just like them, it had learned to build. Cautiously, they followed the pattern, tracing its fractal logic back to its source. It was like following a line of pristine, elegant code through a sea of static. Serafina found she could harmonize with its rhythm, not by adding notes, but by finding the silence that gave its beat a more profound impact. Cale found he could not add color, but he could frame the stark white on black, creating a gallery space that enhanced its beauty. Elias could not add to the story, But he could narrate their approach, framing their vessel as respectful observers, students coming to admire the work of a master. Their art forms, so different in their nature, began to interact, to converse. The source of the mathematical art was not a ship or a planet, but a structure so vast and so complex that it defied description. It was a silent, crystalline lattice that stretched for thousands of kilometers, a library of creation at the heart of the void. Each intersection of the lattice, each facet of the crystal, was a self-contained, perfectly stable pocket of reality. As they drew closer, they could peer into these pockets. One contained a universe where gravity was a repulsive force, and galaxies were delicate webs of matter pushing away from each other. Another held a reality that was two-dimensional, a beautiful, intricate plane of existence where life unfolded like living origami. A third was a universe of pure sound where stars were chords and planets were melodies. Each one was a finished piece, a complete and self-consistent universe prototyped from the raw potential of the Expanse. "This is a workshop," Rostova breathed, the sheer scale of the discovery overwhelming her. "A laboratory where new universes are designed." They had stumbled upon the home of the original cartographers, a species so ancient and so advanced that they treated the stuff of creation as a medium. They were not explorers of the cosmos. They were its architects. The Expanse was not a hostile territory to them, but a quarry, a source of infinite raw material for their work. A profound sense of humility fell over the human crew. Their own creations, their beautiful, emotional, chaotic little solar systems and comets, seemed like children's finger paintings next to the elegant, masterful proofs of these silent creators. They had learned to survive in the Expanse, even to beautify it. This species had learned to tame it, to codify it, to build heavens from its madness. They had not just mapped the world. They had written the encyclopedia. As they drifted in silent awe before the great library, a communication opened. It was not a voice or a text, but a direct conceptual message. A piece of art transmitted directly to their minds. It was an unfolding of the same fractal logic they had followed, but this time it was directed at them, telling a story. It told of the librarians, as Elias named them, a species that had evolved beyond physical form into beings of pure mathematics and consciousness. It acknowledged the humans, the new artists, and their strange, wonderful methods. The message contained no judgment, only a profound academic curiosity. It compared their own elegant, logical proofs to humanity's messy, passionate, narrative-driven creations. It described human art as a symphony of beautiful errors, a chaotic but powerful method of creation that was just as valid as their own. The librarians had watched them. They had seen them rescue the ghost of Eris Thorn, an act they described as mending a broken verse. They had observed them painting comets and singing stars into being. They did not see them as intruders, but as unexpected and fascinating colleagues. The final part of the message was not a statement, but an invitation. It showed them two paths. One led back the way they came, a clearly composed and stable corridor of reality that would guide them safely back to their own universe. They could return home as heroes, bearing an impossible map and a story that would change humanity forever. The other path led into the library itself. It was an offer to stay, to learn, to become apprentices to the architects of reality, an offer to humanity to take its place as a species capable of not just exploring the universe, but of creating new ones. Captain Eva Rostova stood on the bridge of her impossible ship, looking at her crew of artists. They had started this journey as a desperate gamble, a last resort. They had become pioneers, healers, and now they were being offered a kind of godhood. She looked from the safe path home to the infinite, beautiful challenge of the library. Her decision was already made. Elias Vance smiled, his fingers hovering over his script tablets for the last time on this journey, and for the first time on the next. His voice filled the bridge, calm, steady, and filled with infinite possibility, the final entry of the old log and the first of the new. Log entry. Final. The UNS Stargazer has reached the end of its mapped journey. We have found the heart of the Expanse, and it is not an ending but a beginning. Our mission of cartography is complete. Our new mission of creation has just begun.